Welcome to the Emperor's Dragon Part 1, Nestling, Chapters 64 and 65. Let's begin. Sensei. From where he was, All for One forced himself to take a deep breath. Yes, Tomura? He asked mildly, pushing away the pain he felt. It was nearly over. Another day or so at the most, and then there would be multiple copies of some very useful quirks. But this experience had illustrated to him that there had to be a better way. The doctor would be instructed to find it. I need another quirk, the teen demanded. Hisashi activated the sight quirk and looked over at the boy. Even without being able to see him properly, All for One could tell that Tomura was agitated. Why do you need another quirk? Hisashi asked. Tomura had never suggested this before. At least, not after the doctor explained, with examples, the most likely outcome for Tomura taking on another quirk. Gigantomachia was an exception, and the prototypes were, in their own way, exceptions as well. Most died. Tomura knew that. To defeat Izuku. At that answer, All for One shifted slightly. He understood why the teen was asking. Izuku and he had another tiff, and from what Kurogiri indicated, it appeared Izuku didn't even remove his quirk but still managed to hold him off. His son was improving. You do not need to defeat Izuku, Tomura. You do not even need to fight him. He's still soft. All for One breathed out, taking the time to breathe gave him to think. What caused this? He asked instead of trying to argue. Kurogiri had related things to him, but that was from Izuku's side when his son pointed out the disintegrated plaster. He called me a NPC. Tomura howled. Despite the pain he was in, Hisashi almost burst out laughing. Apparently his little dragon was developing a tongue. He was certainly becoming more bold. The change in attitude was somewhat expected as a result of his injuries, and All for One could admit to himself that he was pleased. He would have preferred it didn't come from his injuries, but he'd work with what he had. Tomura, I will tell you what I told Izuku. His friends, especially Ochako, do not have the experience Izuku does. She does not have the experience you do. Seeing the system for what it is, seeing heroes for what they are does not come easily when all you have ever known is that they are good and that they will protect you. But her eyes are opening and you must be patient. In the future, Tomura, you may need to educate others, and so, you must know when to push new information and when you must wait for them to understand. Think of it as if it was one of your information quests. Hisashi explained, though he did wonder why Tomura was so concerned with his little dragon's friend. The teen had never shown any interest in the past unless. Was Tomura jealous? That was a possibility that bore thinking about. You don't learn everything at once. That's because you can't in a game. Tomura sounded petulant, which meant that he acknowledged the point, even if he didn't want to. Regardless, this is similar. Some people will change their minds instantly, others will need to be presented with proof. And others will cling to their beliefs, no matter how wrong, until the day they die. You must recognize what type of person you are dealing with. Izuku's little friend will not cling forever to society's truth. But she instinctively knows she does not like reality. It will take time. All for One avoided pointing out that Tomura had no reason to care about this. If the teen was jealous, then that would only cause him to attempt to be more involved. People were interested in many things that didn't concern them. It was interesting to find out that Tomura was no different. He could tell Tomura wanted to object, but Hisashi could also tell that the teen knew any argument would be countered. They sat in silence for a few moments before Tomura spat. TCH, the teen almost growled. She won't be in my party. At that, All for One chuckled. No, she won't be in your party. He wasn't even sure she'd be in Izuku's party. It was one thing to know that society wasn't everything it appeared to be, it was another thing to actually be prepared to do something about it. He thought Tomura already knew that lesson, but maybe not as thoroughly as he should. I still need another quirk. Tomura demanded again. All for One shifted slightly so that it appeared he was looking directly into the teen's red eyes. I didn't realize you were willing to sacrifice so much. I will have the doctor prepare you for it then. At the word sacrifice, Tomura flinched, and when he said doctor he shifted away slightly. You know what would happen, Tomura. Hisashi drove the lesson home. If you wish to serve me as a prototype, I will not stop you, but I had hoped for so much more. I don't. I just want to do more than disappearing bodies, the teen told him. And you shall, but you are only 14, Tomura, and I do not employ children to do my bidding. I'm not a hero, he reminded him in a very obvious jab. It was enough of a reminder for the teen to know that while he wasn't even old enough to enroll in high school, he was already doing odd jobs, and that was more than many want-to-be heroes could claim. But All for One raised one hand, cutting off Tomura's complaint. You do not need to defeat Izuku. You do not even need to fight him, he repeated his words from earlier. I need you both. I've always told you that. His friends are a weakness, Tomura snapped. Hisashi chuckled again. His friends are controlled, he countered. Little Ochako's parents get work because I say they get work, and that can change. And Hitoshi's parents followed us from Saitama to me after I spoke to them once. While he couldn't see well, he knew Tomura was surprised at those revelations. I tell you in confidence, Tomura, he added. Izuku didn't yet need to know the extent of his control, and he did not control that much. He just knew the best times, phrases and tones to suggest things. People usually saw things his way. Hitoshi's parents truly had a choice in the matter. I will not take orders from him. Tomura snarled. For a moment All for One didn't understand the statement, and then he caught the meaning behind it. You will both report to me. Izuku will not outrank you, he assured Tomura. Remember, Tomura Shigaraki, it is you who bear my name, he added. Izuku wouldn't give Tomura orders, especially not if Tomura remained this insecure. He had little need of insecure servants, and Tomura had a lot of growing to do. He may yet mature, Hisashi reminded himself. He was only 14, and Izuku was only 9. There was time yet. Izuku looked down at his phone when it buzzed. The screen message told him there was a text from Himiko. He opened it. I tried donating blood today, she reported. Never again. Izuku frowned and ran his hand through his currently gold hair. It wasn't quite the ash blonde of Himiko's. It had too much yellow in it for that. Why would Himiko be donating blood? He didn't think you could donate when you were 10, wait. He grinned. Why never again? He sent the question back. The lead-in wasn't normal, but it was obviously a blood joke. Too many stupid questions. Whose blood is it? Where did you get it from? Why is it in a bucket? Izuku chuckled. Really, the first hint that it was a joke should have been the whole donation bit. Himiko took blood, she didn't give it away. Emoticon, he sent the face back. Emoticon came back almost immediately. I'll send you a joke next time, Izuku promised. I look forward to it, Izu. And this is Inko Midoriya, who will be working with us from today. It is good to meet you, Inko said, bowing slightly. She ran her hands down the front of her skirt before rising and giving her new work colleagues a smile. Finally, some extra help, one of them said as their manager retreated. The woman was dressed similarly to Inko. A skirt with a shirt, with her jacket over the back of her chair. I hope I can be of assistance, Inko said softly. Trust me, the woman said. Anything is going to be of assistance, she reassured Inko. I'm Maigo. Inko. I'm Setsu, one of the other women said. The last woman said, spinning her chair around. She was an older woman, her hair turned silver from age. So, why are you here? The question was direct. Inko shook her head, but it wasn't to deny answering the question. The question was direct, but it told her the woman understood. My son. I'm sorry, sweetie, Maigo said instantly. It's not your fault, Inko replied. I know, but I'm still sorry. What happened? Setsu asked. Again, it was a pointed question. Most would say it was too frank, too demanding. Inko knew they had their own stories. She'd moped and cried long enough. When Izuku had been taken. She'd taken a leave of absence from work, but as the days stretched into weeks, and then into months, she knew she wasn't going to go back to that job. It had been a struggle for several years, but as much as Hisashi had been a bastard, and as much as she had obviously never known much about him, there was money in their joint account. She used that. She didn't want to. Not at first. Using it somehow felt like she was accepting a payment for Izuku's disappearance, since most of the money had been put there by Hisashi. Mitsuki had talked her out of that quickly. It wasn't payment. It was their money, family money, and she needed to use it to make sure Izuku had a family, a mother to return to. But the money wasn't going to last forever, even with her limited expenses, so she'd looked for a job. She couldn't go back to her previous job, nor anything like it, but she'd eventually found this one. This job was a small agency that worked with police and social services on missing persons cases. It was funded by donation, so the pay was meager, but she didn't need anything more. They went through paperwork. They looked for discrepancies, anything that might be a lead. They did the type of work the police just didn't have the manpower for. And occasionally their work did lead to the rediscovery of someone. She knew it was a long shot, but this would make her feel as if she was trying. My husband went to work one day, and didn't come back. That wasn't too unusual. He sometimes went on last-second business trips, but when my son didn't come home, Inko didn't need to say any more. Maigo gave her a hug as Yume nodded. For me, it's my brother, Setsu said. I know he's not a saint. He went with a bad crowd. He was in the fighting circles, but one day he went out, and just didn't come back. I looked everywhere, but there was nothing. My mother, Maigo said, pulling back from the hug and directing Inko to where she would sit. There wasn't anything wrong, at least, I didn't know anything was wrong, but one day I just couldn't contact her and she didn't finish. There was no need to. Inko nodded. The police would have found an untouched house. Maybe some small personal effects would be missing, but nothing telling, and nothing to indicate foul play. They would have looked for a bit, but with no leads. And with an older woman, they probably thought she'd just gone somewhere to die. Yume nodded. My husband, she said softly. He's been gone 40 years and I know he's most likely dead, but I just want to know. I just want him to come home. Inko nodded again at that. Izuku had only been gone for 5 years, but she just wanted to know where he was. She wanted to know he was safe, that he was happy. She bit her lip. She couldn't imagine not knowing for that long. Well then, ladies, shall we get back to work? Setsu interrupted. I'll show you what to do, Inko, she added, coming over. We are looking through school records in Iwate. Inko took off her jacket and put it on the back of the chair, making sure that it didn't trail on the ground. What are we looking for exactly? Discrepancies, Maigo answered for Setsu. Families that gained a child unexpectedly. Or who lost a child. The information is sometimes blatant, Setsu explained. It's just that there's so much of it, and the records get muddled. Aren't they electronic? Inko asked. Shouldn't it be simple to keep track of children? The National Registry existed for a reason. Yeah, they are, Setsu said, and the electronic records are perfect. It's in the paper that people hide things. In cash, in comments. In the causal transactions and what is written. Those are the records we're going through. And don't worry about privacy. We don't get the identification papers. We get others, and if we think we've found something, we pass it back to social services. They like to hear about it when someone who has 3 children suddenly only has 2, or if someone with 2 gains a third. Inko nodded. Even without anything sinister happening, social welfare fraud would be of interest. It was probably one of the ways the agency made a bit of extra cash. That's what we are doing this month. In other months we look at adult records, and geriatric records. Geriatric records? Inko asked. She knew there was no age limit on disappearances, but did the elderly vanish that much? Some morons like to abandon their elders, Yume almost growled. Quirkless, or something like that. As if it would sully their bloodline. Humans were all quirkless once. Inko felt her eyes widen and she made a couple of connections. Was Yume's husband quirkless? That doesn't make a difference. She said. It shouldn't, Maigo agreed. But it does to a lot of people. Idiots, Setsu muttered. Inko nodded and gave the women a smile. They understood. She was still in pain. She still missed Izuku. She wanted him back. She would always want him back, but right now, right here, she felt understood for the first time in a long time. And that was enough. It had to be. Natural hair color please, all for one said as Izuku entered the room. How do you know? Izuku asked with a huff. A father has his ways, Hisashi replied, amused. He couldn't see Izuku's hair color. The slight quirk he had was not that precise, but he knew his son. And not my hair color, he added, lifting one hand to gesture Izuku to come closer. His son did so, and sat on the stool that was beside the bed. All for one reached out his hand and placed it on his son's head. He didn't need sight to see the way Izuku leaned into his touch. Have you changed your hair color? He asked, rubbing his fingers through Izuku's curls. It was actually rather soothing. I have now, Izuku said. That's interesting, little dragon, Hisashi murmured softly, still stroking Izuku's head. Daddy? The texture changes with the color, he told his son. Really? Hisashi felt one of Izuku's hands touch his as his son reached up to touch his hair. Try it, he encouraged. He didn't see it, but he felt Izuku's hair change color. At a guess, he thought it went to blonde, then black, then to red, and back to his natural green. The textures felt like that. It does, Izuku said happily. All for one felt a small burst of happiness himself. The open joy in his son's voice was endearing. Izuku loved learning about quirks, even if it was a tiny, almost inconsequential detail. Get the doctor to run some analyses on the different colors, he suggested. Garaki would know what needed to be tested. I will. How are you, Dad? Izuku asked. I am fine, little dragon, Hisashi told him. Garaki is working on a portable breathing device for me. He added. He felt Izuku tremble at that. You shouldn't need it. Little dragon, there is no point in lamenting what you wish things to be. You must deal with what is, he said. It's not fair. His son cried instead. You only helped people, so why were they afraid? Because I represent change, Hisashi replied. Because they don't want people to use their quirks. Because they want things to remain the same, he gave the summary of the reasons. Because they are afraid of me. Why? You know why, he told his son. Izuku might only be 9, but he knew the truth well enough. Because you don't follow what they expect. I'm not. And you won't be either. So you must always be proud of who you are, my little dragon. Never be ashamed. I won't. It was a child's promise, but All for One would reinforce it over time. I have some things for you, he said, rather than responding. Daddy? Izuku asked, curious. It wasn't his birthday yet. And they didn't celebrate Christmas. And that was in the past anyway. All for One sighed heavily. Events have shown me that you can never be too prepared, my little dragon. And while your quirks will do well to defend you against. He sighed again, more softly this time, ignoring the demands of the respirator. Against what you may face, I think they need some power-ups. Or what did Tomura call them? Force multipliers. Despite the lack of feeling between the two boys, Izuku knew the terms Tomura used, and knew what they meant. Hisashi had to admit that the term force multiplier was actually accurate given what he did with quirks to amplify the effects of others. I don't want you hurt by anything. He told his son and did not have to feign the desire in his voice. But if I have the quirks, you won't have them. Izuku objected. Hisashi chuckled. His son was, as always, perceptive. Look at me, he instructed as he pulled 2 quirks to the fore. They were the same, and it was the combination of 200 years' worth of practice. And the fact that his quirk didn't merge quirks that meant he could hold 2 identical quirks at the same time. And these were identical. It was 2 copies of Jiko Chiyu's regeneration quirk. What? Izuku gasped when he saw them. I haven't given it back yet, my little dragon, All for One admitted. Because I wanted to do this. Don't worry, I am going to Kyoto tomorrow to give it back, he informed Izuku. Obviously, he wasn't, but Izuku didn't need to know that. He was going to Kyoto tomorrow. To test out the prototype headgear Garaki had made him and to remind a few underlings that independent practices weren't in their best interest. I should go, Izuku said immediately, no longer focusing on the 2 quirks. No, my little dragon, as you took it for me, she deserves to hear from me, Izuku objected. But then you won't have that quirk. Hisashi chuckled again. I had the good doctor make 3 copies from the original, he explained. 1 for you, 1 for me, and 1 for him to work on. That seemed to relax his son. He was still too soft there. He was not Tomura, but once Giran found someone to take a quirk from All for One would begin to mold that softness. Izuku would learn there were very few people in this world who deserved that from him. The rest, if they weren't out to destroy him, were indifferent. Once Izuku understood that, he would have no issue with taking quirks. I have others for you as well, he said. I want you to be safe, he repeated the sentiment of earlier. Now take that quirk, he instructed his son. Reassured that the woman would be getting her quirk back, and that he'd still have a copy, Izuku reached out and gently took one of the copies. Hisashi watched with All for One as it spread over Izuku's body. He didn't pray, but he did do what he could to tell Izuku's quirk to absorb it quickly. Regeneration was mostly a passive quirk. When the body sensed damage, it activated. There was some conscious control. You could direct it to heal one scratch over another, but it was the passive reliability that All for One wanted his son to possess. Thank you, Daddy. He patted Izuku's head, stroking his curls again. It was a comforting gesture for them both. I have others for you, he said after a few restful moments. Daddy? Other quirks, my little dragon, which will help you, All for One said. With my condition stabilized, I have had the doctor working to make copies of several quirks for you, he explained. Hisashi felt the shift in Izuku's hair as he nodded. Thankfully his son didn't ask how it was possible to copy quirks. He probably thought the doctor could do almost anything with a quirk. That wasn't the case, but the belief was useful for now because All for One knew that if Izuku thought copying quirks gave him pain, he wouldn't take them. Some of them I've had for a long time, and I should have made the doctor copy them earlier, but I didn't want to overwhelm you, he said. It was mostly a lie. Quirks were developing and the quirks of the current generation were stronger than quirks of the previous generations. He kept up because he could combine them. Izuku would be able to keep up because he had no choice but to combine them. Perhaps that was Izuku's main strength. But also, Izuku, some of them I have because their owners gave them to me willingly. They were old, and while they could control their quirks, they wanted to know that some part of them lived on. All for One spun the words carefully. He imagined when Giran found a quirk, repeating that line would give Izuku comfort. What are they? This next one is shock absorption, All for One said, mentally holding out the quirk. Don't worry, I will get a copy of it, he added. He could give the quirks to Izuku but preferred for his son to take them from him. It let Izuku practice his technique. Though, if he was honest, Izuku had always had a good technique in taking quirks. Tomura had never been knocked unconscious. Perhaps they needed to work on that. It was convenient at times if the target didn't complain after they were relieved of their quirk. He'd have to find someone for Izuku to practice on. Izuku reached out to take the new quirk. Under his hand, Izuku seemed to quiver happily. You like it? It's so useful. His son said. If I can absorb shocks, then it won't matter if I get the landing a bit wrong, he explained, referencing the times he could fly. Actually, I could make it an attack. Kilo to get heavier and scale for reinforcement and then just drop. Exactly, my little dragon. I think you will find it has many uses. Which is why I should have given it to you earlier, Hisashi explained. With it, Izuku would be able to run faster, hit harder and generally be a lot more robust. There's one more for you, he said, holding out the last quirk. Izuku took it and All for One could tell his son was examining it carefully. What does this one do? His son had learned it was best to ask before trying. That one is strength enhancement. It was a perfectly serviceable quirk. It would not make Izuku a rival to All Might. Not by itself, but as a foundation, it would be useful. And it would allow him to test a theory. Was it possible for Izuku to absorb the same quirk twice? And if he did, would the effect be the same, or would nothing happen? Or would it work but at a lesser rate? In which case, what rate? They were all questions the doctor would ask, but they were questions All for One was interested in knowing himself. If Izuku could take the same quirk twice, for the same impact, then, pain be damned, the doctor would be making copies of every strength enhancement quirk he had. And Izuku would be getting multiple copies. One for All had only stockpiled 8 people. It shouldn't take too long for Izuku to exceed the moron. And then as soon as Izuku came of age, All Might would be brought to heel. Even if by then the man had passed on One for All. If that was the case, it would be a simple thing to determine who held his brother's quirk and have them brought in. It was a nice thought, but one definitely for the future. I want you to be careful with it, my little dragon. Hisashi said before Izuku could say anything. I will. Izuku assured him. You will practice with Kurogiri on the weekend, All for One added. He had made sure Izuku had nothing to interrupt. And really, his son did not object to practicing with his quirks. It was training he enjoyed. Thank you, Daddy. Will you watch? All for One took a few breaths with the respirator. I will be able to for a few hours, he decided. He felt Izuku's smile and once again cursed All Might. He couldn't see his son's freckles. He couldn't see his son smile. He couldn't. All for One forced himself to calm before anger overwhelmed him. There would be opportunities in future to gain better sight quirks. And he would have vengeance on All Might. It would take time. Hisashi stroked his son's hair again. He had time. All Might is back. The headline was on every news feed, accompanied by a video showing the grinning hero, rescuing several people from an armed villain. It was all the news anchors were talking of. That and the advertisement for the live interview All Might was going to do in a few hours. Sorry, Izuku, Hitoshi said as they walked home. He'd seen his friend react to the news. While the rest of the class visibly sighed with relief when the news had broken this afternoon, Izuku had tensed. The teachers hadn't even cared that kids had their phones out to see the news. It's not your fault, Izuku said softly. Hitoshi sighed. It wasn't his fault, but what else could he say? It's not your fault either. He told his friend. Izuku gave his own sigh, breathing out heavily. Everyone is so happy. They are saying it's a miracle, but what about the people whose friends were killed? Whose brothers or sisters, or mother or father? What about them? Or the people who were injured? It's not a miracle for them, he growled. I know, Hitoshi agreed, because what else could he do? Izuku's statement was true. But you were the one who told me it's the way the world is. It's the way heroes are. Yeah, Izuku conceded. I just wonder what it would take for things to really change. The question was rhetorical. He didn't expect Hitoshi to answer. He wasn't sure anyone could answer. Tomura had. The teen had said the world would change when heroes were shown to be the frauds they were, when All Might was bleeding before him. Izuku had to admit that it would probably take something that dramatic, but he thought it might take more than just taking out All Might. There would have to be others who believed as they did. They would need support. It wasn't something he could really think about. The problem was too large. He needed to talk to his dad, but every time he saw his dad, and saw the injuries, all he could really feel was anger, so he hadn't asked. He would. He would one day, but not yet. It would have to be something big, Hitoshi murmured, obviously thinking about it. But I don't think it could be a single event either, he added. What do you mean? Izuku asked, interested despite the vagueness of what Hitoshi was saying. I mean, I don't think you could change things with just one event. I mean, let's say a villain takes out one of the top 10 heroes. What does that change? The order of the top 10, Izuku answered, looking away from a TV in a shop window that was showing the video. Hitoshi grinned. Yes, but it wouldn't change the system, would it? That's what I mean. To get the system changed, to make people want to change it, I don't think it could be a single event that does it. It might come down to a single event. But there will have to be others before then to show that the system has failed. Izuku thought about that, and nodded slowly. That made sense. Though he still had no idea what type of events would be needed. Maybe someday, he said softly. His friend chuckled and reached out to pat his arm. He smiled when Izuku turned towards him. Yeah, maybe someday, he admitted. I'm sure you'll work it out. Izuku gave a weak smile to his friend, feeling buoyed at the vote of confidence. He had no idea how to change things, but at least one person was sure he'd work it out. That felt nice, and he could almost forget the news. He'd work it out. One day. End chapters 64 and 65. And end The Emperor's Dragon, Nestling. Thank you for listening. Join me again to listen to the next part. The Emperor's Dragon, Fledgling.